Before diving into advanced concepts, we must first clearly understand the three fundamental pillars that support any good opening: control of the center, king safety, and piece development. First, controlling the center means dominating the most important squares on the board: e4, d4, e5, and d5. From here, our pieces have greater reach and can move more easily to attack or defend. That is why, at the start of the game, we must place pawns and pieces that directly influence these key squares, as we see in this example. Second, king safety is a principle that cannot be compromised. A king in the center of the board is constantly in danger. Castling on time should always be our priority, and unless we want the opponent to play a brilliant game, we must avoid any dangerous situation by delaying castling too long. And third, piece development. There is no time to waste on meaningless moves or bringing out the queen just to capture pawns. The essential thing is to activate our pieces as quickly as possible, as we see in this position, securing the king first and then developing the queen, connecting the rooks without losing time, so we are ready as soon as possible for the next phase of the game. These are the most basic ideas and form the foundation upon which all good openings are built. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of these three concepts, not just with words, but with real game examples. So, I invite you to move on to the next video, where we will see a first example about the importance of the center. We are always told to control the center, but often we do not fully grasp how important this really is. Let's look at a first example. The game starts with e4, e5, knight to f3, and knight to c6, after which the Italian opening is set up by developing the bishop to c4. Black responds in kind with bishop c5, and white now plays c3, with the clear intention of advancing d4 to gain absolute control of the center. The best response against this is undoubtedly to play knight to f6, since it attacks the pawn on e4. But instead of this development, Black decided to play d6. This move is not entirely bad, but it allows White to carry out their plans much more easily, advancing directly with d4. The pawns are then exchanged, and the threatened bishop gives a check on b4, after which the knight develops to c3 to cover it. If Black had played knight f6 earlier instead of d6, at this point they could capture the pawn on e4, breaking White's center, and it would have been a different story. But that is not the case. However, Black still has time to try to react against the center by playing the aforementioned knight to f6, castling, and developing the bishop to g4, for example. But once again, they reject these ideas and decide to play h6. Now this really becomes a mistake. Black has neither developed their pieces nor fought for the center, and this brings consequences. I dare say, Black is already completely lost. White continues with the strong move queen b3, threatening the f7 square twice. To meet the threat, Black's queen moves to e7, attacking e4 in return, but this is easily dealt with by castling. After that, the knight is freed from the pin and threatens to jump decisively to d5, so Black chooses to capture it right away. But after the recapture, White's advantage grows even more, since the center is more solid and they have gained the bishop pair. By this point, the knight finally develops to f6, but it's already too late. White is fully ready to attack and push the pawn center forward with e5. Once this center starts moving, it's like a tsunami that destroys Black's position. The pawn is captured, and before recapturing, White plays the intermediate move bishop a3, attacking the queen. The queen under threat can't stop defending the f7 square, so it has to move to d7. Then the knight captures on e5, the knights are exchanged, the pawn recaptures, and the knight on f6 is now under attack, so it moves to e4. White keeps up the pressure with rook to d1, directly targeting the queen. Since the queen must keep guarding the f7 square, its only option to hold the defense is moving to f5. But now, thanks to the development advantage White has gained, as we can see, all their pieces are ready to attack while Black's king still remains in the center. White is going to take full advantage of this and win with a beautiful combination, starting with the capture on f7. This move definitely deserves 2 exclamation marks for what it sets in motion. Black has no choice but to capture the bishop, and then white continues with a strong deflection move, rook to d8. The king is forced to stop defending the queen. After king takes d8, the queen left undefended on f7 is captured. But that's not all. White also threatens the devastating move rook to d1, and the king will have nowhere to hide. Black resigned. But what happened in this game? Why did black lose so quickly in just 18 moves? Let's go back to the critical moment. Black basically let white build that strong pawn center without resistance. They didn't look for ways to counter it and then fell behind in development, like when they played h6, a meaningless move that doesn't address the center or development. All these bad decisions led black straight into the disaster we just saw. In the upcoming lessons of this course, we'll look at many more examples focused on controlling the center. For now, I invite you to head over to the next lesson, where we'll cover another key concept, king safety. Let's get started in the next video. Without a doubt, king safety is the most important concept every chess player must have deeply ingrained. This is why castling should always be a top priority in your games. Throughout this entire course, we will be diving deeper into this idea. Let's start with the basics. We're going to look at the dangers of leaving the king in the center of the board. We have Alexander Alekhine playing the white pieces in a simultaneous exhibition. The example begins with a queen's gambit, and the game quickly heads into the Tarrasch defense when black plays c5. Alekhine continues with the exchange on d5. The second player recaptures with the pawn. The knight develops to f3, and the other knight comes out to f6. In this position, I personally like the move g3, something we might explore in other courses. But in this game, Alekhine chooses a different line, bishop g5, with a very concrete idea. The knight that defends the d5 pawn is under threat, so the bishop is developed to e6. Then the knight is captured, and the queen recaptures. Now the center opens up violently with e4, and the pawn is captured in response. After that, instead of recapturing right away, Alekhine gives a check with the bishop on b5. We will go deeper into this later on, but for now, just remember this. When the center opens up, you have to play fast. Develop your pieces as quickly as possible and get the king out of the center urgently. In that kind of position, moving the same piece twice can be a catastrophic mistake. The right move would have been knight c6, or at worst, knight d7. But what you cannot afford to do is move the bishop again, retreating it to block the check and compromising your development. White recaptures on e4, attacking the queen, which is once again forced to move, this time to b6. The bishop under threat is exchanged on d7, the knight recaptures, and Alekhine, wasting no time, castles. The game continues with a capture on d4, and the knight recaptures its pawn. Let's take a quick look at the position. The white pieces are developed and the king is safely castled. Meanwhile, the black king is still in the center, and the kingside bishop has not even been developed to allow short castling. If we take a closer look, the center is completely open. And in positions like this, the king simply cannot afford to remain in the middle of the board. It must get out of there urgently, even if that means castling on the queen side. And even though the queen side might seem like an unsafe place to castle, leaving the king in the center in such an open position is pure positional suicide. However, the second player makes a decisive mistake by playing rook d8, completely forgetting about castling. 2 question marks are well deserved for this oversight, and it will not go unpunished. Alekhine continues with knight f5, already threatening to jump into d6 and getting closer to the enemy king. Black responds with knight to e5, attacking the queen. But white simply moves it to e2, exerting an X-ray on the opponent's king along the e-file. At this point, the black position is already very fragile. The most reasonable move would have been queen a6, aiming to trade queens and relieve some of the pressure. But instead, they play g6, yet another meaningless pawn move. The end is near. Black has flagrantly violated the most important concept in chess, the safety of the king. Alekhine responds with a spectacular move, queen b5 check, sacrificing the queen without hesitation. Double exclamation marks for this move. If the queen is captured, the game ends instantly with knight f6, checkmate. When principles like these are broken, tactics begin to flourish. So, unable to take the queen, black tries to defend by blocking the check with knight d7. After that, white simply plays rook e1, completely ignoring the fact that the queen is still hanging, because once again, if it is captured, knight f6 is checkmate. The second player, now desperate, finally develops the bishop to b4, hoping to castle, but it is already far too late. Knight f6 comes in with a double check. The king is forced to retreat to f8, followed by knight takes d7, and the rook is forced to recapture. At this point, white could simply take the rook and secure a material advantage, but Alekhine shows no mercy and continues with queen e5. Now there is a mate threat on h8 and another on e8, and there is no way to stop both. The second player has no choice but to resign. In this example, we saw the devastating consequences of neglecting king's safety and leaving the monarch stranded in the center of the board, especially with the center completely open. Now we are going to move on to the next lesson, where we will begin talking about development. We will break it down into 2 parts, starting in the next video. What we are about to see is a very typical mistake when we are starting out in chess. And it is a mistake that even shows up at advanced levels. Let me explain it through this instructive example. White began with 1e4, and black replied with d5, the Scandinavian defense. The pawn is captured, and the queen recaptures. Then the knight develops to c3, attacking the queen, and it moves again to a5. The center is occupied with d4. Development continues with knight f6 and bishop c4. At this point, the second player needs to play c6 to give the queen a safe retreat, either to d8 or c7. White continues developing by playing bishop d2, indirectly putting pressure on the queen. But since the queen already has a safe retreat, black can simply continue with bishop f5, or, for a safer option, queen c7. But at this point, the player with the black pieces falls into one of the deadly sins that also applies in chess, greed, and plays queen b6, attacking both the d4 and b2 pawns, which are undefended. White responds by developing the knight to f3, defending the d4 pawn, which, in terms of central control, is more important than the b2 pawn. Black follows through with the idea and captures the pawn. The first player is now officially down a pawn. The rook comes over to attack the queen, and the only available square is a3. White's knight jumps to e5, putting double pressure on the f7 square. In order to defend, the second player is forced to play e6. And now, white calmly continues by castling. On the other side, the black king is still dangerously in the center, so the bishop moves to e7. The rook is developed to e1, aiming directly at the king, who, to avoid further danger, castles immediately. At this point, let's evaluate the position. White has developed almost all their pieces, while black has yet to develop the queen side. Notice that the black queen captured a pawn, but to do so, it first moved to d5, then a5, then b6, then b2, and finally to a3. That's 5 queen moves, while on the other side, the first player used that time to complete development. And why is it so important to finish development first? Because whoever does it first will seize the initiative. And the one with the initiative gets to attack, and that is exactly what is about to happen in this game. White continued with knight e4, a strong move. The idea behind it is twofold. First, to eliminate the main defender of the black king side, the knight on f6. And second, to clear the third rank so the rook can move to the king side and join the attack. Black probably should have played knight d7, trying to keep a knight on f6 to protect the castled king. But instead, they decide to trade on e4 and the rook recaptures. It could still be the right moment to develop the knight to d7, aiming either to trade on e5 or to bring it to f6 for defense. But the player with the black pieces feels that the queen is too far from the defense of the king, especially with the rook already advancing to b3. So they decide to move the queen again, bringing it back to d6. With no knight on f6 anymore, the queen moves to h5. Notice how the black queen has already moved 6 times, while the white queen has moved only once, and it is to threaten mate. It was still possible to try knight to d7 and put up some resistance, but the second player, overwhelmed by all the attacking possibilities, collapses immediately and plays b5. Double question marks for that move. There is no time for this kind of move. Black's development is seriously delayed, and the king is under pressure from multiple threats. Rook to b3 is played, a strong move, bringing yet another piece into the attack. If the bishop is captured, the rook would come to h3 with devastating effect. So instead, black decides to play f6, hoping to capture the knight and perhaps escape through f7. But with great precision, the response comes with rook g4, a strong move. The idea is that once the knight is captured, the rook will be sacrificed on g7. Double exclamation marks for this move. The king is forced to take it, and now the other rook arrives on g3 with check. After the king hides on h8, its tragic end is sealed with bishop d3, threatening mate on h7. There is no effective way to defend against it, which is why black decided to resign. Let's take note. This king fell because of the queen's irresponsibility, wasting time to capture a pawn, while the rest of the pieces were never developed. A great example of the development advantage, a resource that, when used with precision, can lead to devastating attacks before the opponent even manages to coordinate their pieces. Now we are going to move on to the next lesson, where we will dive deeper into the concept of development and its 4 pillars. A practical guide that will give us a clearer understanding of how to approach this crucial part of the game. We will cover it in more detail in the next video. To work on the concept of piece development, we're going to break it down into 4 fundamental pillars. First, you develop the minor pieces on the side where you're planning to castle. Second, you develop the minor pieces on the opposite side. Third, you connect the rooks, which means developing the queen. And fourth, you activate the rooks by placing them on open files, semi-open files, or files likely to open. It is not mandatory to follow this order strictly, but every good development, in one way or another, fulfills these 4 pillars. But before we go any deeper into that, let's look at a practical example to see how Alexander Alekhine applies it in a real game. The 4th world champion is playing white. The game begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we enter the Ruy Lopez opening with bishop b5. After the move a6, the bishop retreats to a4. Then development continues with knight f6, and white castles quickly. Only 5 moves in, and Alekhine has already developed his kingside and castled. After that, black continues with d6, while white plays c3, preparing to expand in the center with d4. At this point, the knight could capture the pawn on e4, but then the rook could come to e1, putting pressure on the king who is still in the center. So the second player avoids this and instead continues with bishop g4. Alekhine sticks to his plan and pushes d4, aiming to take control of the center. His opponent replies with b5, threatening the bishop, so it retreats to b3. The e4 pawn is still untouchable because white would play bishop d5, attacking both undefended knights and winning a piece. That is why black avoids the capture and wisely continues development with bishop to e7. Alekhine now develops his bishop to e3, his opponent castles, and then he brings out his knight to d2, completing the development of the minor pieces on the side opposite to where he castled. After that, black goes for the typical maneuver with knight a5, attacking the bishop on b3. Once it retreats to c2, the second player continues with c5, trying to challenge white's strong center. The game continues with h3, and after the bishop captures the knight, the queen recaptures, and 2 very good things have happened for white. First, they've gained the bishop pair, and second, the queen has developed, meaning the rooks are now connected. After that, black continued with knight to d7, and now something important happens. Before launching any active operation, Alekhine develops his queenside rook, bringing it to d1, the file he believes is most likely to open, completing his development. White has played the opening successfully. They've controlled the center, secured their king, and developed every single piece. If we take a closer look, Alekhine followed all 4 fundamental pillars of development we've been talking about in this lesson, and he did it in the exact order we presented them. For example, first, he developed his kingside minor pieces and castled. Then, he developed the pieces on the opposite side. After that, he brought out the queen, connecting the rooks, and finally, he developed his queenside rook, placing it in the center. Every well-played opening will end up fulfilling these 4 pillars. Now, of course, development shouldn't be done mechanically, strictly following that order. Far from it. In the chaos of a real game, things rarely go that cleanly. That's why I invite you to move on to the next lessons, where we'll look at how the best players in the world apply these principles in action. Let's continue with his example of Anatoly Karpov to see how he plays the opening. This time, the game starts with an English opening, advancing c4, and Black responds with a symmetrical variation by playing c5. White continues in a unique way with b3, so that after Black develops the knight to f6, the bishop can be placed on b2. Black replies with g6 to oppose the white bishop, after which Karpov immediately captures the knight, with the idea of doubling the pawns. Development continues with knight c3 and bishop g7. One of the main ideas in the English opening is to fianchetto the kingside bishop, so Karpov follows up with g3. The game continues with knight c6, bishop g2, and now Black plays f5. They're probably aiming to capture the knight on c3, return the favor, and double White's pawns, so Karpov decides to avoid that by moving the rook to c1. Notice that in this example, the queenside gets developed first. Black continued by castling, after which Karpov decides to move his pawn to e3. Then, after the second player plays a6, the kingside knight develops to e2. The attack on the queenside continues with b5, and the c4 pawn is supported by d3. Black's development proceeds with bishop to b7, after which Karpov decides to castle. The second player now moves their pawn to d6, and White still needs to connect the rooks, so they move their queen to d2. Black develops their queen to a5. And how did Karpov continue? Exactly. As many of you probably guessed, he completed his development by bringing the rook to d1. At this point, the opening phase concludes. White controls the center, has safely castled the king, and developed all their pieces, fully meeting the 4 development pillars we're studying. And in this case, unlike the previous example with Alekhine, the queenside was developed before the kingside because, as we said earlier, development shouldn't be done mechanically. Since this is important to internalize, let's move on to another example, this time from Kasparov. See you in the next video. Let's look at another example, this time from Kasparov, to see what we can learn in this short lesson. The game starts with 1d4, Black replies with d5, White plays the queen's gambit with c4, and Black responds with c6, the Slav defense. Development continues with knight c3, knight f6, e3, and e6, which transposes the game into a semi-Slav variation. The game continues with knight to f3 and knight to d7. At this point, White chooses to develop the queen first, moving it to c2 before developing the bishops or castling. Black replies with bishop d6, and we might say that the previous examples were quite quiet games, which made development easier. Alright, in this example, Kasparov, typical of his style, immediately forces the action with the move g4, a variation that was very popular in the 90s. The idea is that after the knight captures the pawn, the rook moves straight to g1 to threaten it, and sooner or later the pawn will be recaptured, increasing pressure on the g7 square. Black defends with f5, but the threat continues with h3, forcing the knight to retreat back to f6. Then, as mentioned earlier, the rook captures on g7. Black's knight jumps to e4, and after these skirmishes on the flank, White quickly develops the bishop to d2. The queen moves to f6, threatening the rook, which pulls back to g2. After that, the knight shifts from d7 to f8, and Kasparov decides to secure his king by castling. Following black's knight move to g6, Kasparov develops the bishop to d3, completing the opening phase. Once again, white controls the center well, the king is safely castled, and all the pieces are fully developed. In this case, the rooks aren't yet coordinated, but after bishop to d7, the queenside rook moves to g1. As we saw in this example, the queen developed even before the bishops, and the kingside rook was the first to come into play. But in the end, the order doesn't matter. What matters is that the four pillars of development are always met in any well-played opening. I could show countless examples, as many as there are games, but I believe the concept is already quite clear. Now, to wrap up this lesson, I invite you to move on to the next one, where we'll start working through some instructive exercises. Because development is essential for playing openings well, and it's where I've noticed students struggle the most, we're going to solve 3 exercises to help better internalize this important principle. Let's begin with this first position, where Vishy Anand is playing white. This isn't about white simply playing and winning, it's a strategic exercise. The goal is to clearly understand what white should do. Analyze the position and decide on the plan you want to follow, as well as the immediate move you want to make. Feel free to pause the video and try playing as the Indian champion did. I hope you paused the video and spent some time analyzing the position. White could play, for example, queen to h8 giving check. After the king moves up to f7, white delivers another check on h5, creating a double attack on the king and the knight. But even so, black's king can retreat to g8, since capturing the knight isn't possible due to the discovered check on c5, which would cost white the queen. So this idea doesn't work. So let's return to the starting position. All these queen moves, whether giving checks or trying to capture pawns, are bound to fail because white is behind in development and the queen lacks support from the other pieces. That's why Vishy Anand, in this position, chose to bring the knight to b3 first. According to the analysis module, black should have played queen to g4. This was the right move to keep equality. But instead, they captured the pawn on e4, which was a mistake. After that, Anand developed his bishop to e3. Black moved their bishop to f6, and the Indian champion immediately brought the rook to f1. Notice that only 3 moves have passed, and all 3 white pieces are developed and actively participating in the attack. The position is now completely different from the start. White's pieces are fully developed and poised to strike. In fact, there's a threat to capture the bishop on f6 with the rook, followed by bishop to h6 for checkmate. To prevent this threat, black's knight moves to g4, defending the f6 square. Then the game continues with bishop d4, now threatening to capture twice on f6. After the pawn recaptures, the queen on d7 would be left hanging, which is why it moves to d7. But this turned out to be the decisive mistake, as it now leaves the knight on g4 undefended. After bishop to c5 gives check and black's king moves to f7, white delivers a check with the queen on h5, simultaneously threatening the knight, which will be captured on the next move. For this reason, black chose to resign. I hope you did well in this exercise. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's move on to the next exercise, featuring 2 classics, Aaron Nimzovich playing white and Simon Alekhine playing black. This exercise focuses on black's position. The question is, how would you continue? What's your development plan? More specifically, would you capture the pawn on g2? Pause the video, analyze the position, and try to find the best move. In this position, any move focused on development is a good choice. For example, you could play bishop e7 or e5, or queen a5 giving check, followed by quickly developing the rest of the pieces, castling, and applying everything we've learned so far. But the player with the black pieces decided to capture the pawn on g2, which is very risky since they're far behind in development. After bishop to f3, defending the rook while also attacking the queen, it retreats to g6. Then, with queen to d2, white clearly holds a big lead in development. Still, it wasn't too late for bishop to e7 and castling, although with the g-file open, this also looks very risky. Instead, black chose to push e5, perhaps trying to drive the knight away from its position. But after this, Nimzovich wisely castled, definitely a move worthy of 2 exclamation marks. There is a threat to move the knight and attack along the d-file. So, the knight was captured and the bishop recaptured. Notice how the black king's position has been fatally opened up. There's a threat to move the bishop and then penetrate again on d8. In response, black developed the knight to c6 to defend the square. After this, white responded with another brilliant move, bishop to f6, definitely deserving 2 more exclamation marks. Now, no matter what black plays, the mating threats against their king are unstoppable. The bishop was captured by the queen, and then the rook moved to e1, delivering check. It goes without saying that white completed all their development while black made no progress. If the check is blocked with bishop to e6, mate occurs immediately on d7 because the bishop would be pinned. So let's rewind. Black blocked the check by moving their other bishop to e7. After that, the knight on c6 was captured. If the bishop is captured, then mate follows immediately with queen d8. Therefore, the bishop cannot be taken and the king is forced to move to f8. After that, queen to d8 check comes anyway. Once the bishop captures the queen, mate is delivered with rook e8. In this example, Simon Alekhine paid a heavy price for his adventure of capturing pawns at the cost of falling seriously behind in development. Now, to wrap up this lesson, let's move on to solving the last instructive exercise. See you in the next video. Let's move on to this important third exercise. In this position, black has previously sacrificed a pawn, though they could recover it immediately by capturing on b2. Pause the video, analyze the position, and decide which move you would make along with its possible consequences. Black to move. I hope you paused the video and took some time to analyze the position to get the most out of the exercise. While other moves like capturing on b2 or castling immediately are also good, the English player Jonathan Spielman chose to prioritize development by playing knight to c6, a very interesting choice. Let's explore some instructive variations. The pawn on d4 is under threat. If, for example, it advances to d5, black will castle long. Notice black's development advantage and how white's king still needs several moves before castling. If the knight on c6 is captured, the attack remains very strong with knight e4, as the knight on d2 is pinned and attacked 3 times. If this is defended by the other knight moving to f3, then bishop to g4 follows, and now both knights are pinned. Additionally, black's other rook comes to e8 with decisive effect. I definitely wouldn't want to be the white king trapped in the center, under pressure from all the enemy pieces. It's for this reason, let's rewind a few moves, that white chose not to capture the knight on c6. If instead the bishop on e6 is captured, the strong knight move to e4 returns, once again attacking the pinned knight on d2. After, for example, knight f3, black wins with knight takes d2, knight takes d2, followed by rook to e8, which is terrible news for white's king. Then, after bishop e2, the pawn on e6 is captured, with the threat of continuing with knight d4. The white king cannot escape the threat by castling, because it would stop defending the knight on d2, which black would then capture, followed by capturing on e2 and winning a piece. I encourage you to review all these variations using the analysis module, as they are very instructive. So let's rewind once more. This is why white didn't push the pawn to d5, and instead chose to develop the knight f3 to defend the pawn on d4. Black responded by castling, once again putting pressure on the pawn on d4. This time, the only way to defend it is by pushing d5, and after that, the variations closely resemble those we saw earlier. The second player then played bishop to g4. If the knight is captured on c6, the d-file opens up, and black's other rook comes to e8, making the attack very strong again. That's why white tries to avoid all this. They don't capture any piece, and instead aim to quickly develop the bishop to e2. After that, the knight on f3 is captured. White chooses not to recapture with the pawn to avoid damaging their pawn structure, so they capture with the bishop instead. The rook comes to e8 with a gain of tempo, delivering check. It's not possible to block with the bishop because of knight to d4. That's why the king is forced to move to f1, and since the knight was never captured, it moves to d4. White defended very well, declined black's offers, and the king lives to tell the tale, although it lost the right to castle. Black focused on development and never recovered the pawn they had sacrificed earlier, but with the white king in this position, the material is more than balanced. The second player eventually won much later through a strong attack, as white was unable to properly coordinate their pieces. That concludes today's lesson. I invite you to review and fully understand the concepts we covered so that they become more internalized before we move on to Lesson 2, where we'll dive into more advanced concepts. We've already learned the importance of controlling the center, ensuring the king's safety, and developing all our pieces, the three fundamental concepts of any opening. So far, nothing new under the sun. We've all heard more than once about how important these ideas are, and we understand perfectly well how much they matter in the game. However, just watch a single game by Kasparov, and everything starts to shake. For example, suddenly we see him in this position, leaving the king in the center of the board, or, at best, delaying castling for a very long time. Or maybe we see him in this other example, where the queen comes out aggressively to grab pawns, and it turns out to be the correct move, part of one of the most aggressive variations with the black pieces. Or perhaps we're watching a Carlsen game, where instead of developing a new piece, he ironically decides to retreat the knight to its original square. And in his own words, it's one of his favorite opening lines. We can even find positions where, after 12 moves, 8 of them have been pawn moves, development is slow, and castling hasn't even been considered. And we could go on, listing countless examples that seem to contradict everything we've learned. I'm absolutely sure you know what I mean. But let me insist on something. For an opening to be well played, these three elements must be present: control of the center, king safety, and piece development. The key, and this might be the most important thing to understand about opening concepts, is realizing that both king safety and development are subordinated to the type of center. In other words, the type of center will determine how quickly we need to develop our pieces and get our king to safety. Let's hold on to this essential idea. The more open the center is, the faster our moves need to be. On the other hand, if the center is closed, we can afford more flexibility. For example, moving the same piece twice in the opening in a closed center might not have any consequences. But doing that in an open center could be a fatal mistake. Delaying castling in an open center is almost always a recipe for disaster. But doing so in a semi-closed center might actually be the right thing to do. So, to really understand all of this, let's move on to the upcoming lessons, where we'll examine each type of center and how it affects development and king safety. We'll start breaking that down in the next video. This formation with two central pawns against one is known as the classical center. It is worth noting that the black pawn does not necessarily have to be on d6. It could also be on e6, and the structure would still be considered the same. What matters most is that the two central pawns represent a positional advantage for the side that controls them. Now, regarding the other two concepts, development and king safety, in this type of position, white must castle quickly without delay. Why? Because there are many open lines where the king could be exposed, and on top of that, white needs to defend the center effectively. To do that, they must first eliminate any concern about king safety. When it comes to development, the logic is the same. White wants to activate their pieces as quickly as possible. Why? To be able to capitalize on the strength given by the central pawns. Without proper development, that advantage will be very hard to convert into anything concrete. As for the black pieces, the situation is quite similar. They also aim to castle early and develop quickly. Why? Because they need to contain and neutralize white's center before it becomes overwhelming. To do that, their pieces must be fully coordinated and ready to counterattack. This structure is fundamental, not only because it appears very frequently in practical play, but also because it contains multiple strategic concepts that are essential to master before moving on to more complex ideas. That is why we are going to explore it in depth through several examples, which will help us understand its nuances and subtleties. I invite you to join me in the next lesson, where we will begin with the first one. This next example begins with 1d4, but remember, everything we learn here also applies perfectly to king's pawn openings. Black replies with d5, guarding their center. The game continues with c4, entering the strong and popular queen's gambit, which is declined with e6. Normal development follows: knight c3, knight f6, and knight f3. After this, the second player chooses to play d takes c4, a line known as the Vienna variation of the queen's gambit. If we look closely, black is giving up the pawn that was responsible for guarding the center, and this begins to form the characteristic structure of this chapter, the classical center. White is left with two central pawns, while black has only one. Now, this is not necessarily bad or anything like that. It just means that black needs to keep playing in a way that's consistent with this decision. We will fully understand what that means in just a few moves. For now, the game continues with bishop to g5, pinning the knight. The main response for black is to play in a similar fashion with bishop b4, creating complications. In some cases, the second player can strike back directly in the center with c5. In others, since the knight is pinned, they can defend the pawn with b5. Both ideas aim to create counterplay, but instead of going for any of that, black simply chooses to unpin the knight with bishop e7. White pushes forward and takes full control of the center with e4. Black replies with h6. The knight is exchanged, the bishop recaptures, and now the pawn on c4 is recovered. Here we can clearly see the classical center, a very powerful force in chess. We could say that black has the bishop pair as compensation, but they must strike back at white's strong center. Otherwise, they run the risk of being completely overrun. Therefore, c5 should have been played, an excellent move aimed at breaking the opponent's center. If the pawn advances to e5, attacking the bishop, the correct reply is c takes d4, a strong move that leaves little trace of that once powerful center. Alternatively, if d5 is pushed, the central pawns are exchanged, leading to a characteristic position where white is left with a passed central pawn. We will explore this structure in greater depth in a later course called Pawn Concepts, but for now, so as not to stray from the main topic, it is enough to understand that black has no issues in this position and maintains equality. But instead of going for the strong flank strike with c5, black chooses to develop the knight to d7. On white's side, the minor pieces have already been developed, and now castling follows immediately, without any delay. Why? Because in this type of center, to make the most of the advantage, it is essential to complete development quickly. Black, likewise, does not want to leave the king in the center and also castles. The pawn advances to e5, and the bishop retreats to e7. The rooks are connected as the queen is developed to e2. Black should be thinking about central breaks like c5, but instead responds with rook e8. Now something very important. Let's recall the 4 pillars of development. A very common mistake is to rush into an attack and leave this rook forgotten. That is why, before starting any active operations, white finishes development completely by bringing the queenside rook to d1. The idea is not only to activate the rook, but also to place an X-ray on the black queen, making the central break with c5 impossible. And if there are no breaks to destroy this center, it becomes the most powerful force on the board. Black missed the chance to play c5 when it mattered. Now it is even less possible, and instead they play c6, just to give their queen a way to develop. On the other side, the white queen centralizes strongly on e4, getting ready for the attack. The black queen is developed to c7, and before anything else, the first player completes development by bringing the other rook to e1. White has played the opening successfully. They have controlled the center, secured the king, and developed all of their pieces, including the rooks. They have read the center perfectly and understood the pace at which they needed to castle and complete development. The knight moves to f8. This is done to prevent potential attacks on the h7 square. The queen, ready for the attack, shifts to the king's side by moving to g4. Black still hasn't developed the bishop and only now prepares to do so with b6, while the queen continues her advance to h5. The bishop finally allows the rooks to connect by developing to b7. Now something very important. This will be covered in more depth in the next course, Attacking Concepts, but I want to take the opportunity to mention it here. For an attack to succeed, among other factors, you need piece majority in the attack. In other words, a large number of pieces targeting the enemy king. That is why white brings the rook to e4. Black plays bishop b4, and the rook's purpose becomes clear as it moves to g4, directly targeting the king. The knight on c3 is captured, and white recaptures with the pawn, reinforcing the center. There is now a threat to capture on h6, so the king moves to h8. The knight also joins the attack, moving to g5. Now the f7 square is threatened twice, and it is defended with rook to e7. The knight now moves to e4, ready to settle strongly on d6 if needed, or to jump into the attack on f6. The rook is finally developed to d8, and white's strategy of piling up pieces against the enemy king continues with rook d3. Black finally decides to react in the center with c5, something that should have been played back on move 8, and we are now on move 22. But now it is far too late. Checkmate is very near. The knight jumps to f6. The first player is threatening to sacrifice the queen on h6, because after it is captured, rook g8 would follow with mate, the classic Arabian mate. If you're not familiar with it, I recommend checking out the tactics course. To prevent this, the knight moves to g6 to obstruct the idea, but now the game continues with rook to h3. A picturesque attacking position. Multiple threats are in the air, and with all these pieces swarming the black king, there is no saving him. The engine shows mate in 11 moves at best for the black king. That is why resignation was the only choice. A highly instructive first example of the classical center, where we saw the power of the center in attack, the mistake black made by never reacting in time with c5, and how white coordinated the three key concepts, center control, king safety, and development, to play a strong opening and create a true attacking masterpiece. Now let's move on to the next important lesson, where we will explore the antithesis of everything we've just seen. We will break it down in the next video. The most effective way to counter the power of the classical center is through a central reaction. We already mentioned this in the previous example, when we repeatedly pointed out that black should have played c5, but now we are going to see it more clearly with a direct example. This game also begins with d4, answered by d5. The queen's gambit is once again played, and this time black responds by developing the knight to c6. This is known as the Sicilian Defense. The game continues with knight f3, while the bishop from c8 moves to g4. White then captures on d5, once again removing the central pawn that was controlling the center. The knight on c6 is now under threat, but black replies with an in-between move, bishop takes f3. The first player does not want to ruin their pawn structure, so instead of recapturing on f3, they take the piece on c6, after which the bishop also recaptures. The game continues with knight c3, e6, and now e4, once again reaching the classical center formation. But this time, unlike in the previous example, we will see how black manages to neutralize it. For now, the bishop is developed to b4, pinning the knight and putting pressure on the e4 pawn. To defend it, the pawn is solidly advanced to f3. The queen gives a check on h4, and to block it, the pawn is pushed to g3. The queen then retreats to f6. The bishop is developed to e3, and black castles quickly. Why? To apply pressure and begin neutralizing the strength of white's center. The kingside bishop is developed to d3. Black could develop the knight at this point, but instead chooses to move a piece that was already developed, pulling the bishop back to a5. We will understand the idea behind this very soon. White now castles immediately, and remember, In classical center positions like this, both sides usually castle as early as possible to focus on what really matters, the center. Black once again delays the development of the knight and moves the bishop back to b6. In this case, the maneuver is fully justified, as it now threatens the important central pawn on d4. This also forces the first player to move a previously developed piece, pulling the knight back to e2 to protect the pawn. In this way, the lost tempos are somewhat balanced out. Now we reach the first key moment in the central battle, as Black continues with the strong move e5. The idea is simple: to destroy White's powerful classical center. In response to this move, the first player plays queen d2, setting up the threat of bishop to g5, which would win the exchange. To prevent this, it is finally time to develop the knight to e7. That way, if the bishop goes to g5, the queen can simply move to d6 and keep everything under control. So, White declines that line and instead pushes the pawn to d5, aiming to maintain a strong center, gain space, and at the same time, gain a tempo by attacking the bishop. But that piece is not going anywhere just yet. Black replies with the strong move queen h6, creating a powerful pin. The bishop on e3 is now under double attack. The queen cannot be captured because the bishop on b6 has it pinned. And capturing on b6 is not possible either, since the queen would be left undefended. So, to deal with this threat, the pawn is pushed to f4. Now the threatened bishop finally retreats to d7. The knight, having done its job defending d4, returns to c3. Black captures on f4, the pawn recaptures, and the bishop moves to h3, threatening the rook, so it slides over to f3. And now we've reached the most important moment of the entire game. Notice how Black has played actively at every stage. First they pressured the d4 pawn, then struck with e5, and later created a tactical threat along this diagonal. But despite all of that, White still holds on to this strong central pawn mass. And as we've already learned, that is a very powerful force. If White is allowed to advance the center under favorable conditions, it will almost certainly cause serious problems for Black. But their entire strategy reaches its climax with the critical flank strike f5, which completely shatters White's center. Flank strikes, like c5 in the previous game and f5 in this one, are the most effective weapon against the classical center. This idea of giving up the center in order to later counterattack and destroy it with flank strikes is the original concept behind the creation of hyper-modern openings. We will explore that in much greater depth in its dedicated chapter later on. For now, let's continue with the game. Unfortunately for White, they cannot keep their pawn phalanx harmoniously united by pushing e5, because the d5 pawn would be left under attack, and Black can capture it. After knight takes d5 and rook takes d5, the tactic bishop takes f5 with check, hoping for a discovered attack on the rook, does not work, because Black simply plays bishop takes f5. And after the rook on d5 is captured, the reply comes with queen to g6, check. After the king moves, say to f2, the second player can respond with bishop to e4, delivering a double attack and recovering the exchange, leaving White with an exposed king and Black with a clear advantage. This is why, going back to the main position, unfortunately, e5 cannot be played. As a result, White decides to capture on b6 instead. The queen recaptures with check, and the first player blocks it with the queen on f2. The queens are exchanged and the king recaptures. After that, the complete collapse of White's center comes as Black captures on e4. The bishop on h3 is taken, the other bishop on d3 is also captured, and the rook takes the remaining pawn. Material remains equal, but unlike the previous examples where we saw the power of the classical center, here it was completely destroyed, left in ruins, with isolated and weak pawns on d5 and f4. Black eventually capitalized on these weaknesses in the endgame. The goal of this lesson is not to analyze the endgame. That will have its own dedicated course later on. What we want to highlight here is the strategy used against the classical center, and how both kings were quickly brought to safety, followed by consistent development. When a strong player makes a positional concession like this, giving the opponent the classical center, you can be sure they already have a plan in mind for how to create counterplay against it, rather than sitting back passively and waiting to be crushed. Now let's move on to the next important lesson, where we will see how one side fights to hold on to central control and prevent the opponent from ever establishing that powerful center. We will break it down in the next video. This is a very important example of opening strategy, but let's not get ahead of ourselves and go straight into the game, which begins with a Ruy Lopez. Michael Adams, playing the black pieces, replies with a6. The attacked bishop retreats to a4, and development continues with knight to f6. White castles immediately, and black follows up with bishop e7, entering the closed variation of the Ruy Lopez. The rook moves to e1 to reinforce the e4 pawn, and Adams plays b5, chasing away the bishop, which retreats to b3. The game continues with the pawn advancing to d6, freeing the knight on c6 from its defensive duty over e5. White plays c3, preparing the central break with d4 and creating a retreat square for the bishop on c2, while black, wasting no time, castles kingside. The first player responds with h3, a prophylactic move that allows d4 to be played comfortably, as it prevents the annoying pin with bishop g4. This leads to one of the most important positions in the Ruy Lopez. After that, Adam goes for the classic Breyer variation maneuver, retreating his knight to b8. Here I need to pause for a moment. The last few moves included a lateral pawn push, and instead of developing a new piece, black has retreated a knight. Now, this is not the main topic of this lesson, but it's worth pointing out. We will explore it in much greater depth in its dedicated chapter later on. This is possible because the center is semi-closed, and in this type of structure, slow maneuvers like these are entirely viable. If, for example, the center were open, making this kind of maneuver would almost certainly be disastrous. The idea behind retreating the knight is that after the first player pushes in the center with d4 and begins to pressure e5, instead of capturing on d4 and giving white the classical center, black responds with knight d7. From this point on, notice how the second player clings to the defense of e5, overprotecting the central pawn to avoid giving the opponent any kind of advantage. White develops the queenside knight to d2, and Adams responds by placing his bishop on b7, aiming down the long diagonal and putting pressure on e4, effectively preventing the knight from continuing its path to f1. For that reason, white retreats the bishop to c2, adding more protection to the important central pawn. Adams continues with rook e8. The idea is that after knight f1, the bishop will drop back to f8, allowing the rook to help overprotect the key central point on e5. It also puts indirect pressure on the e4 pawn, but this is easily handled once the knight completes its maneuver and arrives on g3. Black responds with the pawn advance g6, taking control of the f5 square and preparing to develop the bishop to g7. White develops the bishop to g5, momentarily pinning the black knight, but Adams immediately replies with h6, forcing the bishop to make a decision. The bishop retreats to d2, and black continues with the fianchetto, placing the bishop on g7, where it not only strengthens the king's defense, but also adds yet another layer of protection to the e5 square. Notice how black has never given up central control. Instead, they have held tightly to it, maintaining firm control over the key central squares. Had white tried to advance with d5, black was ready and waiting with c6 to immediately challenge and dismantle the center. That is why, unable to find any real advantage, the first player decides to release the central tension by exchanging pawns. Black recaptures, maintaining their control over the center. The game continues with the bishop placing itself on e3, while the queen is developed to e7, connecting the rooks. The white knight repositioned to d2, and now the second player decides to develop the last remaining piece, bringing the a8 rook to d8. And unlike the previous examples, this time black has firmly controlled the center, never allowing white to advance or gain space. As a result, they have effectively neutralized white's initiative. So this time, black has played the opening successfully. Why? Because they controlled the center effectively, brought their king to safety, and developed all their pieces, including the rooks. Black went on to win the game, asserting dominance in the middle game. Now that we've taken a deeper look at the importance of the classical center and all the implications it has on the flow of the game, we're going to move on to the next chapter, where we'll begin exploring another key type of center, the open center. We'll dive into that in the next video. We now continue with the next chapter, where we will talk about the open center. If we look closely, there are no pawns on any of the central files, and that is exactly what defines this type of structure. In previous chapters, we suggested a key premise. The type of center determines how quickly we need to develop our pieces and get the king to safety. The more open the center is, the faster we need to play. So in this type of position, there is no doubt we must castle quickly. Keeping the king in the center for too long usually leads to disaster. Let's recall what happened to black in this position. It is from the Alekhine game we saw back in Chapter 1. Instead of castling immediately, even if it was on the queen side, black chose to play rook d8, leaving the king exposed in the center with open files, and we already know how that strategy ended, in disaster. So, when the center is open, and this must be absolutely clear, there's no room for hesitation or negotiation. If we want to commit chess suicide, then sure, let's leave the king in the middle of the board. We'll even be doing our opponent a favor, giving them the chance to play their immortal game. The concept of development in an open center is a bit more complex, and to understand it better, we are going to look at two examples from two world champions. Let's move on to the next lesson, where the magician from Riga will teach us the first one. Sevely Tartakower once said, "Chess is the tragedy of one tempo." This famous quote takes on its full meaning in open positions like the one we are about to see, where losing even a single tempo in development can lead to truly tragic consequences. Let's understand this better with the following example, where Mikhail Tal, playing white, begins with 1e4, and another world champion, Vasily Smyslov, replies with c6, the Karpov defense. Mikhail Tal replies with a somewhat unusual line. He plays d3, so that when his opponent strikes in the center with d5, the knight can be developed to d2 in the style of the King's Indian attack. Since the center was not immediately occupied by pawns, black takes the opportunity to play e5. The game continues with knight to f3 and knight to d7. Now, all of a sudden, instead of continuing their development, white abruptly changes plans and plays d4. Tension has now arisen in the center. The d-pawn decides to capture on e4, after which the knight recaptures. Then the other pawn captures on d4, and the queen recaptures as well. Only 7 moves have been played, and the center has already opened up completely. It seems this was part of the opening strategy of the magician from Riga, aiming to drag his opponent, a clearly positional and strategic player, into a wide-open position where tactics take center stage, a battlefield where Tal was far stronger. Black continues with knight f6, and the bishop quickly moves to g5, pinning the knight, which is immediately unpinned with bishop e7. Now, the words open center and king in the center simply do not go together. So, without any delay, the magician from Riga castles immediately. Smyslov does not want Mikhail Tal to play a brilliant attacking game with the king stuck in the center, so he also castles without wasting a single moment. Right after that, the knight jumps to d6. The idea here is that, whether black captures it or not, white will end up winning the bishop pair. It is worth pointing out that in a completely open position, bishops become much stronger than knights. The queen develops to a5, targeting the pawn on a2, and to defend it, the bishop quickly comes out to c4. At this point, we need to evaluate the position. Only 11 moves have been played, and white already has the king castled and nearly all the pieces actively developed. On the other hand, although the black king has also castled, the bishop on c8 is still stuck, blocking the connection between the rooks. Black must solve this problem, because in positions like this, with an open center and the game unfolding at full speed, having this kind of issue can often be disastrous, as this example clearly shows. So, perhaps the most solid move for Smyslov would be to play knight to b6, looking for a way to connect the rooks and complete development. But instead, Smyslov decides to push the pawn to b5. Remember when you were told not to move too many flank pawns and to develop your pieces quickly? Well, it's in this kind of open center position where that principle makes perfect sense. Now, the engine actually approves this move, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to what it suggests here, because we're talking about human chess, and not even Smyslov himself managed to solve the problems in this position. Mikhail Tal unexpectedly retreats his bishop to d2, attacking the queen. The best move here seems to be queen to a4, forcing the trade and settling for a slightly worse endgame, but instead, Black decides to retreat it to a6. We will go deeper into this in the attack concepts course, but with the queen completely misplaced on the far side of the board, the conditions begin to align for a devastating attack against the Black king. Tal does not move his threatened piece. Instead, he retreats the knight to f5. If the bishop is captured, then White also takes the bishop on e7 with check, and after king h8 and bishop c3, the engine gives Tal a huge advantage of +4. That is why Smyslov decides to retreat the bishop to d8. If not having developed the bishop on c8 and being unable to connect the rooks was already a problem, now with both bishops stuck on the back rank, the problem has basically doubled. Now Mikhail Tal is not going to quietly retreat his bishop. Instead, he brings his queen to h4, launching a direct attack on the king's side in true Tal fashion. The piece sacrifice is accepted, while the queen moves to g5, threatening immediate mate on g7. To stop it, Black must play either g6 or knight e8, or the move Smyslov actually chose in the game, knight h5. The idea here is not to analyze every possible variation in this complex game, but rather to understand the fundamental concepts of the position. After Smyslov's last move, Tal decides to check with the knight on h6, the king moves to h8, and now the knight on h5 is captured. Capturing the piece on h6 also looks extremely dangerous because of bishop c3, so Black decides instead to counterattack with queen takes a2, threatening immediate mate. The bishop, meanwhile, moves to c3, not only giving the king an escape square, but also pointing directly at the enemy king. Giving check with the queen on a2 would have been a waste of time. The best defensive move for Black was to play bishop to f6. But in this completely open position, where tactics are coming from every direction, it is easy to go wrong, and Smyslov plays knight f6. This turns out to be a serious mistake, because Tal replies with queen takes f7, double exclamation marks. The queen cannot be captured, because after rook takes d8, it would lead to mate in 3 moves. If only Smyslov had one more tempo to develop that bishop and connect the rooks, none of this would have been possible. Since the queen cannot be taken, and something must be done because White is threatening the smothered mate by sacrificing the queen on g8, the best reply for Black is to check on a1. The king steps up to d2, and now that rook takes d8 is no longer available, Smyslov can finally capture the queen on f7. But after this, the rook is captured with check. Once the king moves to g8, the white queen is then taken on a1. And when the king recaptures the knight, the material balance in this complex tactical labyrinth ends up with Tal being up the exchange. Smyslov resigned just 4 moves later. If anyone wants to dive deeper into this game, they can do so using the Lichess study. For now, what we take away is that the key concepts were: Black never found the time to develop their queenside bishop, and as a result, they were never able to connect their rooks, which turned out to be catastrophic. In open positions, piece activity and tactics become especially important. And we also got a preview of the concept of the queen being too far away from the king's defense. Now we're going to take a look at a game by Capablanca to explore an example of a concept we've probably heard mentioned many times. But we'll talk more about that in the next lesson. For this example, we are going to look at a game played between Aaron Nimzovich and Jose Raul Capablanca, which begins with a queen's gambit. The Cuban player replies with e6, and the game continues with knight f3, knight f6, after which Nimzovich steps away from the well-known theoretical paths by playing e3. Black calmly develops the bishop to e7, and after knight d2, Capablanca is already castling. On the other side, the bishop is developed to d3, and since White did not place the pieces in the most aggressive way, Black immediately goes for the central break with c5. After this, the pawn is captured, and the bishop could already recapture, but instead, Black wisely prioritizes development, bringing the knight to a6. White decides to castle. The pawn is now captured, attacking the bishop, which is forced to retreat to e2, losing a tempo. Black continues developing with b6, aiming to bring the bishop out along the long diagonal. Nimzowitsch captures on d5, and the knight recaptures. Notice how the center has opened up, and as we already know, in this kind of center, quick development is essential. The game continues with knight b3 and bishop b7. The knight on c5 is captured, the bishop recaptures, and now the white queen is developed to a4. After that, Capablanca develops his queen to f6, connecting the rooks, while white decides to trade the light-squared bishops on a6. Notice how the bishop has moved, first to d3, then to e2, and now to a6, losing several tempos, while black has made much better use of their development. Capablanca simply trades, Nimzowitsch recaptures, and now the knight jumps to b4, attacking the queen and forcing her to lose yet another tempo as she moves to e2. Now the kingside rook is developed to d8. White tries to chase the knight away with a3, but the knight advances to d3. This strong piece cannot be tolerated, so the knight retreats to e1. The knight is exchanged, white recaptures with the rook, and black completes development by bringing the last missing piece, the rook from a8 to c8. Notice how Nimzowitsch has moved this same piece more than once during the opening, in an open center, while Capablanca has played their cards much more effectively and taken the lead. And as we learned earlier, this kind of advantage becomes even more significant in open positions. White plays rook b1 in order to finally develop the queenside bishop, which has been stuck on c1. The black queen moves to e5. Nimzowitsch could now play b4, but instead decides to go for g3 first. Capablanca then moves his queen to d5, and white finally goes ahead with b4. The bishop retreats to f8, and at last, the white bishop is developed to b2. Since black completed development first, they have the initiative, and play queen to a2, making things uncomfortable for white. The queen is chased away by rook to a1, but this powerful piece keeps up the pressure by moving to b3. The bishop tries to block the central files by moving to d4, while the rook enters c2 with force. The queen, under threat, moves to a6, and in order to bring the other rook into the attack along the 7th rank, Capablanca decides to sacrifice a pawn with e5, double exclamation marks for this move. After the capture, as we said, the rook moves to d2, threatening to take on f2, and the pawn cannot be defended by rook to f1, because then the queen captures on e3, and if taken, mate follows in 3 moves with the 2 rooks. Notice how in this example, having just 1 tempo of development advantage allowed black to seize the initiative, which was later converted into a powerful attack. So that old concept of not moving the same piece twice applies perfectly to open center positions, where development needs to be quick. Otherwise, what we saw in the previous 2 examples can easily happen. Now that this concept is clear, we'll move on to the next chapter, where we'll start talking about the fixed center. We'll go into that in the next video. The fixed center in chess is a structure where the central pawns of both sides are locked against each other, with no immediate possibility of advancing or being exchanged. As we can see in the following position, it is worth noting that if we, for example, shift this to the E file, the structure would still be considered a fixed center. When it comes to development and king safety, things are essentially the same as in open center positions, since, as we can see, there are still plenty of open lines that can be used to attack the king. So castling early and developing all your pieces remain a top priority. In addition to that, there are 3 fundamental concepts we need to understand when playing these fixed center structures, and they are: first, we must quickly place our rooks on the open files adjacent to the pawns, as these can become important entry points into the enemy position. Second, we should occupy the squares to the sides of the opponent's central pawn, for example, e5 and c5 for white, and e4 and c4 for black, since these are often key squares to place our pieces. And third, of course, we must attack the opponent's central pawn, which in many cases becomes isolated and weak. Now, all of this is the theory, Let's move on to the next lesson, where we'll see how Alexander Alekhine puts all these concepts into practice with absolute clarity. In this example, the fourth world champion plays with the white pieces and opens with e4. His opponent, Eric Eliskases, replies with c6, the Caro-Kann defense. White takes the center with d4, and black responds with d5. The central pawns are exchanged and the second player recaptures. We're already beginning to see the fixed center forming, although not very clearly yet, since central breaks are still possible. For now, Alekhine continues with c4, entering the well-known Panov attack. Development continues with knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight f3, and bishop e7. White then decides to exchange on d5, and black recaptures with the knight. The game continues with the bishop giving check on b5, and the opposing bishop steps in to block. The bishops are exchanged and the knight recaptures. After that, Alekhine also captures on d5, Eliskases recaptures, and with that, we've reached the structure we mentioned in the introduction, the fixed center. Earlier, we concluded that castling, with so many open lines, is absolutely a priority. But it should not be played mechanically, and for that reason, Alekhine first develops his queen to b3. He's targeting the weak pawn on d5, and everything is calculated. There's no real threat along the e-file, and a possible check with the queen on a5 is easily met with the simple move bishop to d2. Surely, if there had been any real danger, Alekhine would have castled earlier. So, going back to the position in the game, black decides to play knight to b6 in order to defend the weak pawn. Now there is no more delay. White castles quickly, and the healthiest option for the black king with this open file is to do the same. After that, development continues swiftly with bishop f4, aiming at the square next to the enemy central pawn, just as we discussed earlier. Black tries to contest this with bishop to d6. With great judgment, Alekhine decides not to oppose the exchange of bishops. Now, there's no longer anyone defending the e5 square, which will later become a perfect outpost for the knight. And at the same time, he's gotten rid of what could become a bad bishop. We also mentioned earlier that one of the key concepts in this structure is to occupy the open files adjacent to the pawns. That's why Alekhine continues with rook e1, Eliskases replies with rook c8, and Alekhine immediately contests the file with rook c1. After that, black plays the prophylactic move h6, and now everything is ready for white to occupy the square next to the pawn with knight e5. As we can see, all the concepts we discussed earlier were applied in this game. Alekhine eventually went on to win later in a very instructive rook endgame, which we'll possibly cover in its corresponding course later on. I hope this example has made the opening strategy much clearer when playing this type of structure. But before we wrap up this short chapter, let me show you another instructive example involving the fixed center. Except this time, ironically, it's Alekhine who ends up on the losing side. I'll tell you all about it in the next video. We are in the famous AVRO tournament of 1938. With the white pieces is a young 27-year-old Mikhail Botvinnik, and with the black pieces, the reigning world champion, Alexander Alekhine. The opening structure we have on the board features a key position that we will explore in more depth in the Pawn Concepts course, the isolated queen's pawn. But for now, let's take a look at this example. It's black to move, and they decide to play b6, with the idea, of course, of developing the bishop along this open diagonal. But this move turns out to be an inaccuracy. The key moment is that, right after this, Botvinnik, with great positional understanding, and we'll soon see why, decides to capture on d5 with the knight. Alekhine was forced to recapture with the pawn, and just like that, the pawn structure has shifted into a fixed center, the central theme of this chapter. The threatened bishop moves to b5, putting pressure on the knight on c6. If black defends it with bishop b7, then the diagonal is closed and the bishop would run into its own pawn. So instead, Alekhine chooses to defend the knight with bishop d7. Quick development continued with queen a4, once again targeting the piece on c6. Alekhine chose to defend with a somewhat strange move, but we'll come back to that in a moment. For now, if the knight on c6 were to be defended with rook c8, then development continues with bishop f4, and after, say, rook e8, the other rook takes over the open file with rook c1. And white has a slight opening advantage, having developed their pieces more quickly and actively than their opponent. And in this type of center, that small edge is worth gold. This was Botvinnik's idea behind the correct decision to capture on d5. So, to avoid all of this, and going back a few moves, Alekhine decided to defend the knight on c6, not by moving his rook, as we just saw, but by retreating the knight to b8. Although in this case, the cure turned out to be just as fatal as the disease. Botvinnik continued developing at full speed with bishop f4. The black bishop captured on b5, the queen recaptured, a6 was played, and the queen returned to her previous square. The game continued with bishop d6, the bishops were exchanged, and the black queen recaptured. After that came, perhaps, the most important move of the entire game, rook c1. Let's remember that in this type of position, controlling the files adjacent to the central pawns is extremely important, which is why development must be completed quickly. Alekhine is in serious trouble. If he now develops his knight to d7, the rook enters c6, attacking the queen and gaining tempos. So he looks for an ingenious solution. He moves his rook to a7. White brings the queen back to c2, securing full control of the open file. Since the rook can no longer be exchanged on c7, black tries to trade the other rook on e7. The rooks are exchanged, black recaptures, and the white queen infiltrates the enemy position by moving to c7. The queens are also exchanged, after which Botvinnik recaptures with his rook, entering a clearly favorable endgame thanks to his active rook on the 7th rank. We will go deeper into this concept, using the open file to reach the 7th rank, in the Piece Concepts course, but I could not miss the chance to point it out here. Botvinnik went on to win this endgame in great style, a moment that carried deep symbolic and historical weight, as it marked a true changing of the guard in the world of chess. The young Soviet master outplaying the reigning world champion in both preparation and strategic vision. Up to this point, things should be much clearer. Whether it's the classical center, the open center, or the fixed center, the key remains the same. Castle early and develop your pieces quickly. Now we're moving on to the next two chapters, where we'll start to encounter several exceptions, the semi-open center and the semi-closed center. We'll dive into that in the next video. In chess, a semi-open center is a structure where one of the central files has a pawn of your own, while the other remains semi-open. For example, in this position, white has a pawn on e4 guarding the center, while the d file is semi-open. For black, it's the same idea but in reverse. A pawn on d6 controls the center, while the e file is semi-open. It's worth noting that if the central pawns were switched, white's on the d file and black's on the e file, the structure would still be considered the same. Now, regarding how the center relates to the other opening concepts, the fact that the word open appears, even if it's only half open, suggests that the other concepts should also be carried out quickly. For example, let's see how Adolf Anderssen played it back in the 19th century, although this still applies perfectly well today. The game begins with 1e4, answered by e5. The knight attacks the pawn from f3, and black decides to defend it with d6, the Philidor defense. White advances in the center with d4, the pawn is captured, and the queen recaptures. We're already starting to see the characteristic structure of the semi-open center. The knight moves to c6, and white, in order to not lose time by moving the queen again, quickly develops the bishop to b5, pinning the knight. Black replies with bishop d7, breaking the pin. White, again avoiding loss of tempo, decides to capture on c6, and the opposing bishop recaptures. Now the other bishop is quickly developed to g5, attacking the queen, and the second player responds with knight f6, developing a piece while also covering the threat. Development continues with knight to c3 and bishop to e7. Now, since the center is semi-open, there are open lines toward the kings and possible central breaks, so the first player, without delay, decides to castle. For the same reasons we mentioned earlier, black does the same. After that, white completes development by bringing the last piece into the game with rook e1. It's only move 10, and Anderson has already developed all his pieces, placed his king safely, and established firm control over the center, which means he has played the opening successfully. As we can see, all the opening principles we've learned up to this point have been followed, and the 4 pillars of development we discussed earlier have also been fulfilled. So, up to this point, nothing has changed in this semi-open center compared to what we've already learned. But the fact that the word semi is involved means that there can be quite a few exceptions, and those exceptions are exactly what we're going to start exploring in the next video. This type of semi-open center appears in openings such as the main line of the Caro-Kann, the Rubinstein variation of the French defense, or the Scotch opening. But where we see it most prominently is in the open variation of the Sicilian defense. So let's take a look at an example. Playing the white pieces is former Oxford professor John Nunn, who begins the game with 1e4, and his opponent replies with c5, the Sicilian defense. The game continues with knight f3, e6, and the center opens with d4. Black captures the pawn, and Nunn recaptures with the knight. We're starting to see this type of semi-open center, where white has one semi-open file and a pawn on the other. On the other side, in this case, the second player has both central pawns still in place, and their semi-open file is the c file. The fight continues with the development of the knights on the queen side, after which black plays d6. Development continues with bishop e3, knight f6, and bishop c4. The second player responds with the thematic move a6. The idea is to secure the c7 square for the queen, protecting it from any possible knight jumps to b5, while also preparing pawn advances on that side of the board. After that, Professor Nunn continues with queen e2. The idea behind this move is that after the expected development of the black queen to c7, white will be able to castle long immediately. At this point, let's highlight that it's only move 9, and the first player has already brought the king to safety and developed almost all of their pieces. Black continues with knight a5, attacking the bishop, which retreats to d3, and then follows up with the queenside expansion b5. But wait a second, the second player is pushing pawns on the queenside, moving the same piece twice, and leaving the king in the center, delaying development. Well, what we need to understand is that all of this is happening because black is taking advantage of the possibilities offered by these two central pawns, which are keeping the position somewhat closed. If the center were open, playing with this kind of strategy would be madness, as we already know. Let's also point out that white doesn't have an effective pawn break to open up the enemy king's position. Or, well, there is one, but we'll see it a bit later. Professor Nunn doesn't want black to play b4 and drive the knight away, so he decides to play a3. But this is also a risky decision, as it creates a potential breaking point in white's castling structure, something we'll explore more deeply in the attack concepts course. For now, I don't want to stray from the main focus of this course, so the player with the black pieces decides to develop the bishop to e7, so that the king has castling available in case of any eventual complications. White continues with the strong move g4. The Sicilian defense is one of the most exciting openings in chess. If the king stays in the center, it will be attacked, as we'll see later, and if black castles short, they'll still be attacked through a pawn storm. That's why we see this aggressive pawn advance. On the other side, black will often counterattack on the queen side, and that's why they respond with rook b8, indirectly aiming at the king. White does the same and brings the kingside rook to e1. Things are starting to get very tense. The knight jumps to c4, while white also pushes the g5 pawn, threatening the knight, which retreats to d7. The king remains comfortably placed in the center of the board. If Professor Nunn pushes f4 and supports the central break with e5, the second player can either capture the pawn or push d5, and the king's position remains closed. If instead of e5, the first player tries to break through with f5, black can also respond with e5 if necessary, and still keep the king's position closed. But white has to do something. The black king can't just get away with ignoring the most fundamental principles of chess. That's why we go back to what we said earlier. In this kind of position, there is a way to open the center and catch this king by surprise. Well, one way is to sacrifice the knight on d5, so that when it's captured, Professor Nunn recaptures with the pawn and permanently opens the file where the king is sitting. The other option is the one that actually happens in the game, very similar in idea, which is to bring the other knight to f5. These are all thematic sacrifices in the Sicilian Defense that appear in many games, used to punish the king's position. What should black do in response to this strong move? Well, they should have captured on e3, or even better, counterattacked immediately with b4, trying to go after the white king as quickly as possible. But what they shouldn't have done is exactly what they did in the game, capture the knight. Because after that, Professor Nunn continues by first bringing the knight to d5, gaining a tempo by attacking the queen. The best response is to retreat the queen to d8, getting ready for what's coming, because white is about to capture on f5, opening the e file. There's a threat to move the bishop with decisive consequences. The center is now open, and this is no longer a safe place for the king, so he castles immediately, and is probably just thankful he didn't die in the center of the board. Now, just because black has an extra piece and managed to castle doesn't mean they're going to win, because now they have to face a strong attack against their castling after queen to h5. The black king ended up getting checkmated just 10 moves later. I understand you might want to see how the game ended, but the attack against this castling setup is a topic that goes beyond the scope of this course. Here, we're focusing on understanding, and allow me to go back a few moves, white's opening strategy, how they developed all their pieces, got their king to safety, and took control of the center. On black's side, we saw how they developed their queen side to launch a counterattack against the opposing king, while their own king stayed in the center for a long time, until white, through a violent piece sacrifice, forced them to castle. In any case, if anyone wants to see how the game ended, you already know you can find it in the light chess study. Now we're going to take a look at another instructive example, this time with Vishy Anand playing the white pieces, taking advantage of the semi-open center to delay castling and keep the king in the center for a while. However, there's one big problem in this case. His opponent is Garry Kasparov. I'll tell you all about it in the next video. The year is 1995. The chess world had experienced a schism. In addition to FIDE, a new organization had emerged, the Professional Chess Association, better known as the PCA, and the World Championship title was on the line. With the white pieces was the challenger, Vishy Anand, who opened with 1e4. With the black pieces stood the defending champion, Garry Kasparov, who replied with his most powerful weapon, the Sicilian Defense. The game quickly headed into the open variation. That is, white opened the center with d4, black captured, and the knight recaptured. Then came knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, which was defended by knight c3. Kasparov usually continued with a6, the Najdorf variation. But for this match, he had something special prepared, the dragon variation, beginning with g6. The game continued with bishop e3, bishop g7, and f3, preventing any annoying knight jumps to g4. Short castling followed, then queen d2, preparing queenside castling. After that, Kasparov developed his knight to c6. Anand developed his bishop to c4, controlling the critical d5 square and applying pressure along this diagonal. Black continued with bishop d7. White could have castled long at this point, but instead chose to retreat the bishop to b3. Kasparov continued his development with rook c8, making use of the semi-open file. Anand could still castle, but instead chooses to launch a kingside attack with h4. The idea is to push h5, aiming to break through with g6, to disrupt black's castling and launch an attack along the h-file. However, Kasparov wasn't going to be caught off guard so easily, and immediately stopped the advance with h5. There was no more time to waste for white. Now was the perfect moment to castle. This is the main line of the dragon, which has led to epic battles throughout history with both colors. But Vishy Anand, perhaps wary of Kasparov's deep theoretical preparation, decided to deviate. Instead of castling, he chose to exchange the knight on c6, a move that is far from ideal. As black recaptures with the pawn, brings another pawn to the center and opens the b file. If white castles long, this file could become even more dangerous than the c file. Notice how the b file aligns perfectly with the bishop on g7. Even though it seems irrelevant, since that bishop is about to be exchanged right away with bishop h6, Kasparov begins expanding in the center with c5, threatening c4 to harass the white bishop. The bishops are then exchanged on g7, black recaptures with the king, and to stop the c4 push, the white bishop moves to this square. Black develops the queen to b6, attacking b2. To defend, white could castle and then, after rook b8, play b3. However, they once again delay castling and play b3 directly. Kasparov responds with bishop e6. If white captures, black recaptures with the pawn, controls the center, and opens the f file. That is why Anand avoids the exchange. But if the first player does not exchange, they must prevent black from capturing on c4, so they solve this by advancing the knight to d5. Kasparov captures, the pawn recaptures, and the game continues with e5, a strong move. We are now on move 19, and the king still has not castled. White has taken advantage of the benefits provided by the type of center, which, in this case, is more closed than open. There are no attacks along the e-file, nor along this diagonal, or even this one. So, up to this point, there have been no problems for the king, who could now castle and complete development. However, instead of that, since black had previously played e5, white decides to capture en passant, which turns out to be a serious conceptual mistake, opening up the center while the king is still stuck in the middle of the board. A storm is now heading toward the white monarch. Kasparov is not going to recapture on e6 and give Anand time to castle. Instead, he immediately strikes with d5, apparently the move Vichy had overlooked. The pawn cannot be captured because black plays rook to d8, attacking the bishop twice. After white defends with c4, black then captures, and the bishop, now pinned, is lost. So, since the pawn cannot be taken, the bishop must retreat, for example to e2. Kasparov is not going to waste time recapturing on e6. Instead, he plays the powerful move c4, stopping white from castling kingside due to the queen's action, and also preventing queenside castling. Because if Anand tries to castle long, then black captures on b3. After the recapture, the queen can take on b3 again since the pawn is pinned, and white is completely lost. So, Anand didn't castle when he had the chance. He overestimated the possibilities that the center gave him, and now, unfortunately for him, he won't be able to castle anymore, and he will pay dearly for it. Feeling the pressure, he quickly collapses with the move c3. Kasparov continues with rook e8. Anand decides to capture on c4, but the rook recaptures on e6, and now threatens to double up on the pinned bishop on e2. So the white king moves to f1. Black's other rook also moves to e8, aiming directly at e2. If the white rook moves to e1, the bishop will once again be pinned, and the king left without any safe moves, so Anand prefers to move the bishop to d3. The trades continue. The pawn is captured on c4, and the bishop recaptures. The king's worst nightmare has come true. The center is completely open, and the rooks are disconnected. The bishop has moved 6 times, while black has developed and coordinated all their pieces, and now delivers the final blow. Knight e4, double exclamation marks for this move. If the knight is captured, the rook will land on f6 with decisive consequences. And if it is not taken, the queen is under threat, and so is jump through on g3. That is why Anand, playing white, in just move 25, and in the middle of a world championship match, decided to resign. A sobering example of the dangers that always come with leaving the king in the center of the board. We can conclude that in positions with a semi-open center, the word open tells us we should castle and develop quickly. But the prefix semi also suggests that we can delay a little, though always at some risk. And if it happened to Anand, let's not think it cannot happen to us. Now, since this type of center is so important, and because it's where the most common mistakes tend to happen, we'll move on to the next video, where we'll go through 3 exercises based on 3 typical positions in this semi-open center. We'll break it all down in the next lesson. Let us start with this first position. White was supposed to castle at this moment, but instead decided to play the risky move g4. They are threatening to push g5, leaving the knight without any retreat squares. How did Black respond to this threat? Pause the video, analyze the position, and try to find a strong reply. The player with the black pieces responded with the strong move d5, double exclamation marks for this move. Against a flank push, a response in the center. A move that makes even more sense, since the white king remains in the center, and opening the position will bring serious consequences. For example, let us look at some variations. If the pawn is captured, bishop takes d4 follows, a good move. And now, no matter how it is recaptured, with a pawn, queen, or even bishop, knight takes f3 check comes next, with a double attack winning immediately. It is important to note that the knight cannot be captured because the bishop is pinned. If instead of capturing on d5, white decides to push g5, black responds by capturing on e4. After capturing the knight on h6, the second player recaptures on f3. It turns out the bishop cannot move, because if it does, let's say to f1, black wins immediately with knight c4, delivering a discovered check while also attacking the queen. Let us examine all the problems the white king faces when the center opens. After d5, and returning again to the main position, white could neither capture nor push g5 and had to play h3 instead. Black continued by capturing on e4, and after the recapture, the second player kept opening the position with f5. I invite you to analyze the consequences of this advance. White ended up resigning just a few moves later. A first example where we saw the dangers of overextending in a semi-open center. Now, let us move on to the next exercise. In this new position, the center can open at any moment through this break. The black king still remains in the center of the board, and this piece is undefended. White took advantage of all these factors to unleash a powerful attack against the enemy king. Pause the video and try to play as the white player did. In this position, white's attack began by opening the center directly with d5, a strong move. If black captures with a pawn now or later, the same scenario from the main line will occur, so for the moment, they choose to recapture with the knight. The exchanges continue. Rook recaptures, and now the queen moves to g4, attacking the bishop while also targeting the g5 square. If only the king were already castled, none of this would be possible. If the bishop moves, for example to d6, the queen enters g7, and the king will be trapped in the center of the board. For this reason, black decided to retreat the bishop to f8, but this will not save them either. The game continued with rook c1. The threatened queen moved to d7, and now comes a nice diversion move, rook c7. The idea is that after the queen captures, it stops defending the e6 square, allowing the white queen to enter this square with check, while also attacking the rook. Bishop e7, the capture on d5 took place, and the king remains trapped in the center of the board, unable to castle. The game continued with queen d7, and of course, the queens are not exchanged. White's queen retreats to b3. In desperation to activate their out-of-play rook, black pushes g5, but the white rook quickly comes to d1, attacking the queen again. After the queen moves to c6, the attack continues with rook c1. White must prevent the queen's entry into c8, so the queen moves back to d7 to keep blocking it. But now the bishop moves to b6, threatening a decisive entry on the 7th rank. To prevent this, the bishop moves to d6, but the response is rook d1. The bishop is pinned, and bishop to c5 is threatened, so to prevent this, the queen moves again to e7. But now comes the final blow with queen d5. It turns out that if the doubly threatened piece moves, the entry on d8 will end with the capture of the rook on h8, leaving white with a material advantage. For this reason, black resigned. Another example where we clearly saw the dangers of delaying the king's safety in the center, hoping the center would not fully open. Now, let us move on to a third exercise, because two are never enough. For this third exercise, we have a similar position. The white king still remains in the center and has decided to launch an attack with their pawns on the king side. I believe we already have a clear idea of what to do. Pause the video and try to play as the player controlling the black pieces did. We might think the immediate move is to play d5, but white would respond with e5 and keep the center closed. That is why the correct response is to play e5 first, trying to open the e file directly. After, for example, f5, now the response is d5, after which the center will open in every possible way, and the white king will begin to regret having taken such a reckless strategy. After, for example, f6, the bishop can deliver check on b4. And suppose white responds with c3. Tactics will always favor the player who executes the strategy correctly. Black could reply with the strong tactic knight takes b2. After, for example, the knight is captured, black recaptures on c3 delivering check. When the king moves to f1, material is recovered by capturing on b2. And of course, the white king is in much greater danger than the black king. Additionally, the coordination of white's major pieces is hindered. I invite you to analyze the position more deeply using the analysis engine. Now that we have studied the semi-open center and seen its implications alongside the other two opening concepts, let us move on to the next chapter, where we will discuss a very similar type of center, the semi-closed center. We will explore this more in the next video. A semi-closed center is a type of structure where both central files are partially closed by pawns, but not completely blocked. In other words, the pawns are still mobile. We often find this in openings like the Italian or the Ruy Lopez when d3 is played, as well as in openings that begin with 1d4. The game becomes less tactical but deeply strategic, as one must stay alert to possible central breaks, as well as flank attacks, which take on much greater importance. Regarding development, we mentioned in the course introduction that the more closed the center is, the slower the game tends to be. So, moving the same piece more than once may not be a big issue, and flank pawn moves start to make much more sense. As for the king, if in the semi-open center it was sometimes possible to leave the king in the center, with a slightly more closed center, it becomes even more feasible. Strategies where the king stays in the center for a while, waiting for the opponent to castle first in order to launch a fierce attack, and then castling to the opposite side, are much more common in these positions. But now let's move on to the next video, where we'll see how the first world champion handled this type of center. We'll talk about it in the next lesson. Wilhelm Steinitz, playing the white pieces, begins with 1e4. His opponent, Joseph Blackburn, replies with e5. The game quickly transitions into a Ruy Lopez. The bishop is attacked with a6 and retreats to a4. Development continues with knight f6, attacking e4, which is defended with d3. Black replies with d6 as well. We're already starting to see a semi-closed center. This example is from the year 1876. At that time, during the heart of the Romantic era, chess was characterized by open games and direct attacks against the king. But the first world champion was laying the foundations of positional play, showing a new way to approach the game, marked by a closed center and a slow style, full of subtle positional maneuvers. Even though this game is nearly 150 years old, the opening concepts remain completely relevant today. White continues with c3, giving the bishop a safe retreat, preparing a possible d4 later on, and also denying the d4 square to the enemy knight. Black follows up with bishop e7, while Steinitz now plays h3. Notice that White's last three moves have all been pawn moves. Blackburn decides to castle right away, while White develops the queen to e2. Since the center is semi-closed, Black can afford to retreat the knight to e8, aiming to start a kingside attack with the f5 pawn push. But Steinitz prevents this by advancing the pawn to g4. It's worth noting that if the center were open, this move would almost certainly be a conceptual mistake, but with a closed center, it is fully justified. Black decides to break the bishop's pressure on the knight by pushing b5. The bishop retreats to its safe square on c2, while the other bishop is developed to b7. White has barely developed any pieces, and only now do they decide to play knight to d2. Now, let's pay close attention to the maneuvers from both players. Blackburn plays queen d7, and the knight that had already been developed is moved again, this time to f1. Black does the same, pulling their knight back to d8, and this position, with both knights on the back rank, really needs to be highlighted. I insist, this is only possible because of the nature of the center. The white knight moves to e3. This piece has now moved 3 times in the opening, while the king is still in the center and development is far from complete. A long journey, 5 moves, just to capture a piece that had only moved once. And the most remarkable part is that this maneuver is completely correct and highly beneficial for white, who now holds the bishop pair. So, who was it that taught us not to move the same piece multiple times in the opening, not to play side pawn moves, and to castle as quickly as possible? Maybe they should have also taught us that all of that depends on the type of center we're playing. Once Steinitz completed his kingside maneuver, he finally turned to development, placing his bishop on e3. The knight on e8, which was blocking the rooks from connecting, moves to g7. And it's only now, on move 17, that Steinitz decides to castle queenside. A long but worthwhile delay. At this point, we could say the opening phase is over, and that both sides have handled it with relative success. The kings are safe, both sides have some control of the center, and all 4 rooks are connected, which means the remaining pieces have been developed. Let's recall something we mentioned back in the first chapter, when we talked about the 4 pillars of development. The order does not matter, nor do the exceptions, but at the end of the day, every well-played opening follows these 4 pillars. We could say that the rooks are still undeveloped, but let's remember that since the center is closed, the game is slow, and there are not even open files yet, so the development of these pieces has been delayed a bit. I'd like to close this example by saying that Black continued with c5, and Steinitz responded, very wisely, with d4. He shifted away from his initial kingside plans and instead decided to open the position with this central break, with the goal of imposing the advantage he had previously gained, the bishop pair. It's an important concept in modern chess, and one you'll fully understand later in the course on piece concepts. With this example and everything we've learned so far, I think we now have a better sense of when to play the opening at lightning speed and when to play it at a turtle's pace. Before we close this chapter, I want to highlight something fundamental. The most important concept in chess is king safety. Because if the king falls, nothing else matters. By now, we have a better sense of when it's possible to delay castling. But even so, a king in the center of the board is always exposed to certain risks. And those risks must be understood, evaluated, and most importantly, never underestimated. Otherwise, we might end up just like in the next example we're about to see. In this example, we have the Danish player Bent Larsen playing the white pieces, opening with a line that bears his name, 1b3, the Larsen opening. With the black pieces, we have former world champion Boris Spassky, who replies with 1e5. The idea behind this opening is to exert long-range pressure along the diagonal, so white develops the bishop to b2. The pawn on e5 is under threat, so black defends it by developing the knight to c6. The game continues with c4 and knight f6. Pressure on the e5 pawn continues with knight f3, and black defends it by pushing e4. The attacked knight moves to d4, and development continues with bishop to c5. The knights are exchanged on c6, and black recaptures with the d-pawn. White plays e3, blocking this strong bishop and preparing to develop their own. After that, Spassky continues with bishop f5, overprotecting the e4 pawn. White responds with queen c2, and black replies with queen e7, once again defending the central pawn. The game continues with bishop e2 for Larsen, and Spassky castles queenside. Notice how smooth black's development has been. In just 9 moves, they've firmly taken control of the center, castled to safety, developed all their pieces, and even connected the rooks, with the rook on d8 ready to enter the game. Meanwhile, white is still behind in development, and their king remains in the center of the board. And even though the center is closed, that is still a dangerous situation. White could continue with knight c3 and perhaps castle queenside, ending up in a slightly worse but perfectly playable position. However, they choose to embark on a pawn-pushing adventure, playing f4. From this point on, the game becomes significantly more complicated for white. Black responds with knight g4, an excellent move that threatens the dangerous queen entry on h4. Now, short castling is too late because Spassky could continue with rook takes d2. 2 exclamation marks for this move. The consequences are decisive. For example, if white captures the rook with the queen, then bishop takes e3 f check follows and wins instantly. And if instead Larsen captures on d2 with the knight, then Spassky responds with knight takes e3, attacking the queen and setting up a dangerous discovered attack, which would also lead to a winning position for black. I invite you to explore all these lines in greater depth. So, as we've just seen, it's already too late for white to castle, and faced with the threat of queen h4, they choose to play g3. But this creates other problems. Spassky now has a powerful breakthrough point on h4, and they immediately take advantage of it by pushing h5. Larsen replies with h3, but the breakthrough is so strong that black completely ignores the knight and plays h4. After h takes g4, black responds with h takes g3, dangerously opening the h-file in their favor. If white captures on h8, black recaptures with the rook, and the entry on h1 would be devastating. That's why Larsen decides to keep the rook defending the first rank with rook g1. Notice how the center is completely closed, yet that hasn't stopped the white king from coming under a dangerous flank attack. Black continues with the brilliant move rook h1. After the rook is captured, g2 follows, and now, if Larsen plays rook g1, then the queen enters powerfully on h4, and after king to d1, the move queen to h1 is completely decisive. White tried a clever defense. Instead of moving the rook to g1, they played it to f1, with the idea that if black promotes and captures the rook, at least the promotion square would be defended by the bishop. But Spassky didn't capture the rook right away. He first played queen h4, and after king d1, then he captured the rook on f1. White resigned, because if they now take the new queen, bishop takes g4 follows, then king c1, and queen e1, followed by mate. Mate to the white king, stuck in the center of the board, never having castled. One of the finest games in the career of former world champion Boris Spassky. Conclusion: not castling and leaving your king in the center is always playing with fire. Here's my recommendation. If you're already an advanced player, you can learn to evaluate the risks involved and keep your king in the center, depending on the type of center you're playing. But if you're still in an earlier stage of your chess journey, castle as soon as possible and get your king to safety quickly. It will save you a lot of trouble. Now, since this is such an important topic, and just like with the semi-open center, there are many exceptions and common mistakes, we're going to move on to some exercises that will help us dive deeper into this concept. We'll get started in the next video. For this first position, we have none other than Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces. Notice that the center is semi-closed, with the central files blocked. But also note something very peculiar. The rook on g8 has moved, making castling impossible, so the black king is stuck in the center of the board. So, the question is, how would you play with the white pieces? Pause the video and try to play like Magnus did. In this position, Carlsen is about to launch a very quick attack against the enemy king, starting with c4, a strong move. The idea is very simple, to open up the center of the board. Black decided to capture on c4, and before recapturing, white continued opening the center by taking on c5. The queen recaptured, and only then did white take on c4 with the knight. The game continued with black playing king e7. The idea is simple, to clear the way for the rook to reach d8 and attempt what's known as castling by hand. But Magnus is not going to allow this and continues with b4. The queen is attacked and captures the pawn, after which the knight retreats to d3, once again threatening the queen. After a move like queen b5, the white queen enters decisively on d6. The king is forced to retreat, tragically, back to e8, and now the queen retreats, for example, to a3. The threat of knight to d6, combined with the black king's inability to castle, gives white a decisive advantage. Let's move on to another instructive exercise. In this second exercise, we have Anatoly Karpov with the white pieces. Since the center is semi-closed, it may seem like there's no danger, and he hasn't castled yet. With the black pieces, we have Judit Polgar. Pause the video and try to play like the Hungarian grandmaster, taking advantage of the white king still being in the center of the board. To exploit this situation, black played bishop to b4 check, placing it between the queen and the bishop on b5. After the bishop is captured, black takes the light-squared bishop, which now prevents the white king from castling. The game continued with pawn takes pawn, after which the bishop moved to c4, an intermediate move. The attacked queen moved to a3, and the pawn on a5 was calmly recaptured. As we can see, the king still hasn't solved the castling issue, and will soon face the full force of black's attack. The advantage is decisive. If you'd like to see how the rest of the game unfolded, you can always find it in the complimentary light chess study. For now, this exercise is complete. As we saw, this is something that happens at all levels, even to the best players in the world. So now you know. We can sometimes keep the king in the center for a while, taking advantage of the type of center, but always with great caution, unless we want our position to end in disaster. Now we're going to move on to the next chapter, where we'll see the difference and how it can actually be much more feasible to keep the king in the center for a longer time. We'll talk about it in more detail in the next video. In chess, we talk about a closed center when the central files are blocked by pawns from both sides that cannot advance, exactly like we see in this position, and that is what sets it apart from the semi-closed center we discussed earlier. It is a very important structure to understand, since many openings quickly lead to this kind of setup. To explain the key concepts we need to know about this center, let me show you an example from Anatoly Karpov, where everything will be much clearer. Since the center is closed and completely locked, as we mentioned earlier, play on the flanks naturally becomes much more important. That is why white plays h3, and Karpov, commanding the black pieces, replies in the same way with h6. Now, if the white king castles, black will launch a direct kingside attack with g5. And in the same way, if black chooses to castle, he will face a pawn storm starting with g4. That is why, in this case, the best strategy is to even keep the king in the center of the board, so white plays bishop e3. Karpov develops his queen to a5, targeting the c3 pawn, and to defend it, the opposing queen comes out to b3. Now there's a threat of queen to b5 check, forcing a queen trade and doubling the c-pawns, so black retreats the queen to c7. A complete waste of time, but in this fully locked center, it has little to no relevance. The knight that had already been developed now retreats to d2, a move that doesn't seem to have much purpose other than simply waiting. Karpov brings his knight to h5, threatening to jump into f4, so to prevent that, white pushes the pawn to g3. After that, the important flank maneuvers continue with g5. For white, castling kingside would mean exposing the king to a direct attack, so they choose to castle queenside instead. Play continues with the black knight moving to g6, the bishop retreating to e2 to target the knight on h5, which steps back to f6, and then white's queenside rook moves to f1. Now, let's pay close attention to Karpov's next maneuver. First, he brings his queen back to e7. Then, after white makes their move, in this case queen b1, the king moves to d8, and on the following move to c7. This maneuver became iconic thanks to the brilliant idea behind it. Karpov understood that castling kingside would be suicidal, and that the best place for his king was on c7, where it could cover both weaknesses at once, the d6 pawn and the b7 pawn. Let's also point out something important. We are on move 19, and the queenside bishop still hasn't been developed, and it will not be developed until move 23. This is something I like to call the delayed development of the queenside bishop, and it is a recurring feature in this kind of closed center. It's something we must always keep in mind. We can also say that in these closed center structures, games tend to become quite long. For example, this game lasted all the way to move 84, so it would be impossible to cover it entirely in this course. As you know, if you want to see the full game, it's available in the Light Chess Study. For now, what really matters is that we can conclude the following about these closed center positions. Development is slow. Moving a piece twice, or even more, can be completely harmless, and in many cases, the queenside bishop will not be developed until well into the middle game. As for the king, keeping it in the center for a long time can actually be the safest strategy, at least until both sides have clarified their plans. That way, you avoid committing to a flank and exposing the king to a direct attack. All of these concepts are very important to understand, so we are now going to move on to the next lessons, where we will focus on specific examples of each idea to help internalize everything more clearly. Let's get started in the next lesson. Let's begin with this first example. In this position, white still needs to develop the kingside and castle, while black still has to bring the queenside pieces into play. The center is semi-closed, and since pawn breaks are still possible, it can easily transform and open up. For example, black could play e6, and the threat of central pawn exchanges would suddenly make the white king very uncomfortable in the center. That is why white needs to play knight to f3 quickly and get castled. Moves like h4 or g4, with the central tension still unresolved, would clearly be a strategic mistake. But instead of playing e6, black decided to simply take one more step forward and push the pawn directly to e5. And this small change, as insignificant as it might seem, completely transforms the strategy across the entire board. That's how important the center is in chess. Now the center is completely closed. This makes it a safe place for the white king, while the black king is already castled. That is why Yuri Averbach, playing white, now goes for g4, a strong move. As we mentioned earlier, when the center is locked like this, flank attacks become much more important, and with the enemy king on that side of the board, even more so. Mr. Oscar Pano, with the black pieces, retreats the knight to e8, and we will soon see the idea behind it. Meanwhile, the flank attack continues with h4. The second player tries to open up the position with f5, but the attack comes swiftly with h5. White is threatening to capture on g, and then on f, which would open both files very quickly against the king, leaving him highly exposed. To prevent that second exchange, black pushes f4. Yuri Averbach's attack continues with g5, and Oscar Pano brings the rook to f7, preparing to defend the second rank. Now, since the light-squared bishop is trapped behind its own central pawns, white decides to trade it for the opponent's good bishop by bringing it to g4. The queen retreats to d8 to help with the defense. The bishops are exchanged, and the queen recaptures. Now, only on move 16, the knight finally develops to f3, while Mr. Pano retreats his bishop to f8, so the rook can defend the h7 square if needed. And now we reach the most important moment of this lesson. Yuri Averbach plays king e2. With the center completely blocked, this becomes the safest place for the king. Meanwhile, unlike in many other positions, the castled black king becomes a perfect target for attack. I invite you to compare this position with the Alekhine game we saw at the beginning of the open center section. Continuing with the example, black developed the knight to d7, the pawns on g6 were exchanged, and the rook advanced to h4. The rook moved to g7 so that the king could escape through f7 if needed. The queen joined the attack from h1, and the bishop moved to e7. The rook entered on h8 with check, forcing the king to move to f7. The queen broke into the enemy position by moving to h6, and after the knight moved to f8, the remaining rook joined the attack from h1, completing a flawless strategy by white, who went on to win just a few moves later. I hope this example helped make the concept of when it is actually effective to keep the king in the center a bit clearer. Now, let's move on to the next example, where we will focus on that important idea we mentioned earlier, the delayed development of the bishop. We will explore it more thoroughly in the next lesson. Developing the knights before the bishops is usually the most advisable approach in the opening. Knights need to come out early to control central squares and find useful moves. Bishops, on the other hand, because of their long range, can afford to wait a bit longer. In many cases, they stay on their original square, since they already aim at the opponent's territory from there, and their development is delayed until a safe square becomes available. Also, when the center is closed, this becomes even more evident. Let's take a look at an example in the following game. The example comes from a King's Indian defense. White goes for the main line, developing the bishop to e2. Then Black strikes in the center with e5, but the first player ignores it and simply castles kingside. The knight develops to c6, and in response to the pressure on d4, White pushes d5, gaining a tempo by attacking the knight, which retreats to e7. Now the position has a closed center. This shapes the middle game plans for both sides. White, on one hand, will look for the c5 break to activate play on the queen side, while Black aims to create an attack on the king side, trying to break through with f5. The game now turns into a race to see who gets there first, so White, without wasting any time, pushes b4. For Black, developing the queenside bishop at this point makes no sense. It would just be a waste of time in terms of the attack. So instead of sticking to the usual development plan, they pull the knight back to e8, aiming to push f5 quickly and prioritize the kingside attack. It's also worth highlighting that this knight maneuver is only possible because the center is closed. In an open center, doing this would almost certainly be a disaster. After that, White begins to put pressure on the queen side with the move c5, while Black answers on the king side with f5, launching their own counterplay. The knight retreats to d2, aiming to jump to c4, where it will put pressure on the weak d6 square. Once Black has pushed the f-pawn, the knight returns to f6, targeting the e4 point, which is defended with f3. After that, the attack continues with f4. The knight reaches c4, while the second player pushes ahead with g5 to keep the kingside pressure going. White does the same on the queen side by advancing with a4, while Black brings more pieces toward the enemy king with knight g6. White's queenside bishop is developed via a3, so it can apply pressure along this diagonal. The rook immediately moves to f7 to get out of the X-ray attack, and the advance continues quickly with b5. Black no longer has time to defend the diagonal by retreating the bishop to f8, because if they do, the first player would break the pawn chain at its base with b6. So they are forced to capture on c5, and after the bishop recaptures, they continue their kingside attack by pushing h5. Each side stays true to their correct strategy, and that is why White continues with a5, pushing ahead on the queen side. Black breaks through on the king side with g4, while the advance on the opposite flank goes on with b6. The second player ignores all of that and continues with g3, getting dangerously close to the white king. The king, feeling a bit uneasy, steps over to h1, with the idea that, if needed, the bishop can retreat to g1 to help in the defense. The black knight now moves to h7, first to clear the way for the queen to reach h4, and second, to join the attack later via g5 if needed. White can no longer afford to switch plans and start thinking defensively. They must stay active on the queen side, looking for something concrete to divert their opponent's attention away from the king. And that is why White continues with d6, but once again, Black completely ignores it and plays queen h4, threatening mate in 1. If the first player tries to defend with h3, the bishop is already waiting to sacrifice itself decisively on that square. So instead, to stop the threat, the bishop retreats to g1. Now, due to the closed nature of the position, and with both sides racing on opposite flanks, Black had completely ignored the development of the queenside bishop. It was only at this point, on move 22, that they finally decided to bring the bishop out to h3. It's important to point out that this bishop was already fulfilling the same role from d7, or even from c8. White's best defense would have been to capture the bishop. After queen takes h3, threatening mate with the pawn push to g2, they could have defended by sacrificing material with rook f2. But instead, they made the mistake of capturing on c7, going down fighting. After that, the second player delivered mate in 5 moves, starting with bishop takes g2. There is no choice for white. They are forced to capture. Then comes the spectacular queen sacrifice on h3. After the forced recapture, knight g5 is played with check. And this is where we remember that earlier retreat to h7. The first player's only move is king g2, followed by knight h4 with check. King to h1 is forced, and finally g2, checkmate. An example that shows the true complexity of chess. Black had serious positional disadvantages on the queen side, yet still managed to deliver checkmate to the white king and win a spectacular game. This concept of delayed bishop development appears quite often in many popular openings, such as the Italian game, the Ruy Lopez, or the King's Indian Defense, among many others. I hope that with everything we've covered so far, the concept we introduced at the very beginning of the course is now a bit clearer. The center is the main element, and it influences every other opening principle. Now we're going to move on to the next chapter, where we'll talk about a type of center with an undefined structure. We're talking about the dynamic center. We'll explore it in more detail in the next video. The dynamic center is a complex structure where there is tension between the central pawns, as we can see in this position. The type of center hasn't been defined yet, and it could take any form. Just a single move is enough to close the center, open it, or lock it into a fixed structure. For example, Judith Polgar, playing white, could push the pawn to d5, and the game would immediately turn into a closed center, with all the strategic consequences that come with it. But instead of pushing, she could also exchange pawns on e5, and the center would then become a fixed center. However, rather than choosing either of those two options, she decides to develop her knight to d2, keeping the tension in the center. Black could keep all these possibilities on the table by playing a waiting move, like queen c7 for example. But instead, they choose to remove the central tension right away by exchanging everything on d4. And now, after the knight recaptures, the position has opened up. And let's remember, an open position means fast play. There's no time for slow maneuvers like in a closed center. Let's see how Judith handles it. Black plays rook e8, and white goes for b3, planning to quickly develop the bishop to b2 on the next move. The second player responds with g6, and once the minor pieces are developed, what comes next? Exactly, connecting the rooks by developing the queen. That's precisely what white does, bringing the queen to f3. Black places the bishop on g7 to challenge the one on b2, and after that, the first player completes development by bringing the last remaining piece, the queenside rook, to d1. White has played a successful opening. They have a pawn in the center, their king is completely safe, and all their pieces, including the rooks, are developed. Let's go back to the beginning of the course and see, once again, how the 4 pillars of development have all been fulfilled. As a conclusion, we can say that in a dynamic center, where there is central tension and the structure can open up at any moment, there is no room for speculation when it comes to the king's safety. That is why castling early is always a healthy and reliable option. I believe there's no need to show additional examples, as we did in the previous chapters, because in these positions, the central tension will eventually be resolved, and the game will naturally transition into one of the many types of center we've already studied. So I hope that everything we've learned up to this point has helped make our approach to the opening phase much clearer. I truly hope you enjoyed it, and more importantly, thank you for trusting my content. See you in the next course.